Good evening and welcome to UNE's one-night teach-in on climate and justice. My name is Devon Aparicio and I'm a senior health, wellness, and occupational studies major with a minor in psychology here at the University of New England. I will be your moderator for this evening's panel on navigating climate anxiety. During this session, each of the panelists will speak for about 5 minutes. After all of our panelists' comments, we will open up for questions and discussion with the audience for the remainder of the session. Our panelists this evening are distinguished faculty here at the University of New England. To begin, we have Jan Froehlich, Associate Professor in the Department of Occupational Therapy, Cyndi Amato, Associate Clinical Professor in the School of Social Work, Hilary A. Powell, Assistant Professor of Psychology, Selma Holden, Assistant Clinical Professor in the College of Osteopathic Medicine, and Eryn Neptune, Health and Wellness Educator. Thank you for joining us this evening, and I will hand it over to our first panelist, Jan Froehlich, to begin.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk about moving forward with listening exchanges. It's really tough to face the realities of climate change, climate injustice, and it can bring up a whole bunch of feelings. Particularly, as our introducer said, anxiety can be a huge factor for us, but discouragement can also be a huge factor. And I'm going to talk about a particular tool for battling with discouragement, anxiety, fears, any of the feelings that come up related to climate justice. And I thought we would start, one tool is to put our attention on what we love and appreciate about nature. And I don't think this poll everywhere slide, we had trouble. Poll everywhere doesn't like working with multiple slides, so I don't think it's going to come up. But just take a moment and think about a place that you cherish in nature or anything in nature at all that you cherish. Hold that in your mind for a moment, because just always keeping that on the forefront of our minds helps us go forward in addressing climate grief, climate anxiety, climate discouragement.
I see trees, ocean, and water.
Oh, it is?
Here, but not up there.
Oh, but not on there. Okay. All right, well, let's move forward to the next slide. Okay, I have practiced something called listening exchanges for a number of years and found that this is immensely helpful for dealing with the discouragement and all the feelings that come up around climate. And what's helpful is we get to find connection with another person. We get to vent the discouragement, the grief, and the fear with others, and find hope in moving forward. So I want to give us a chance to try this out. I'm going to set a timer on my phone for about 2 minutes each, and I want you to, with somebody nearby you, take an opportunity to take turns listening to each other and have a chance to vent. This will be confidential sharing, so you won't share with anybody else what your partner shares. And I've got a couple of other pointers on this. Whoops. Actually, something's a little missing, but that's, oh, it looks like one slide might be missing. We want you to pay full attention. Don't give your partner any advice. Show your caring, and we'll try to make sure this is shared equal time that you're sharing. So would everybody find a partner in the room? And if there are 3 of you, that's fine as well. I'm going to set a timer for 2 minutes each, so you can take turns listening to one another for 2 minutes each. And if we have triads, you'll have to time for yourself for about 1 minute each. And take a chance to talk about both what's frustrating, any feelings of discouragement that comes up, and also what brings you hope in dealing with climate justice. Okay, you can figure out who's going to talk first, who's going to listen first, and you can begin. Alrighty, thank you so much. So that was a quick exposure to using listening exchanges. We vent together, we connect, and we can go forward. We get more energy. The more we connect, the more we vent, we clear our mind, and we go forward. Our next panelist.
Goodness. So after all of that, I get to depress you all again. I knew this was going to happen. When Jan was telling us what she was going to do, I said, and then they're going to hand it to me, and I'm going to talk about injustice and marginalization and oppression. So I apologize in advance, but it's so very, very, very important. To understand, I don't have any slides.
Oh, just your name?
No, just my name, Cyndi Amato. I am in the School of Social Work, and I'm the director of the Bachelor's of Social Work program. So I'm going to come at it from a social work perspective, which I think sometimes is misunderstood or not known. Is sort of what do social workers do and what do they base their work on? I think we have a lot of different ideas in our heads of what that is. But one of the things is we have values that we help us make decisions and understand the world around us. And I'm just, two of them that I think are most relevant to the conversation tonight is social justice and dignity and worth of the person. And those are things that we carry with us when we think about what's going on. The other piece about social work is that we employ the principle of person and environment. And a lot of times I think people think about person and environment and they think of it from the standpoint of where they live or who their family members are or their friends or some of those more human aspects. So the other pieces that we look at too are sort of the economic, the political, how do political decision-making affect people's lives and their ability to have well-being, their family. But also one of the things that is really important is the natural world that we're part of. And I think one thing that Reverend Yearwood really, really touched upon is how marginalized people are really bearing the brunt of climate change in a lot of different ways. We're dumping hazardous materials near poor people and people of color. We're taking land away from indigenous people or wanting to put pipelines through it. I mean, there's a lot of different things that are unjust, just for somebody's culture. So from a social work lens, of course, we have a stake in addressing it. That's what our call to action is to be a call to action for social justice for everyone and to find those things that are creating barriers for people to have equal access to all the things that make our lives really wonderful. And if we're taking away their environments, if we're taking away their ability to have good health, then that is an injustice that we see. So, because this talk is more on navigating climate anxiety, one of the things that I ended up doing is I decided to look a little bit more in about the mental health implications of climate change, and there are a lot of them. Needless to say, I think we all experience them. But to put it into context, part of that mental health is not just mental illness, mental disorders, or behavioral disorders, or any of that. I found this to be really, really interesting to think about it more holistically of what are we working towards, and maybe this is the more hopeful piece of what I'm going to talk about, and that is to think of mental health as a state of mental wellness, of emotional resilience, and of psychosocial well-being. So if we know what we're working towards, then those are our goals, and that's what we want for everybody. And we have had policies and people and systems and oppression that have limited people's ability to have social well-being. So anyway, so that is sort of in the context of that. So I found some of this really interesting information that I just wanted to share with you, just for you to keep in your cap, and I hope that maybe you'll want to look into it a little bit more. But when climate isn't part of the equation of how we understand health inequities, then there's no way to really understand how it's impacting people, and especially marginalized people. So we have to really add that to the dialogue. I know that there have been other panels that are talking about, social determinants of health, but a lot of times mental health is not included in that. And really, what ends up happening is nobody talks about mental health. And I know that I'm probably preaching to the choir now, because I think all of us in this room know that mental health is a really huge impact in all of our lives, and we have to talk about it and address it. And the other thing to think about it, and this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to be able to specifically link mental health outcomes to climate change, it's because mental health outcomes have huge root causes, and they just don't happen overnight. So you think about those people who are more marginalized, they're going to be starting at a different starting line than somebody else. They've been pushed back. And so when climate change is on that, you're going to see that the mental health consequences are going to be sort of accelerated by climate change, just as it is for all of us. So something just to think about of how it's really affecting other people. And when I talk about like marginalized folks, just some general areas to think about is like socioeconomic status. So we were talking about poverty before. We were talking about culture. So there are different cultures that we don't respect that, and the environment is affecting their cultures and their way of life and their mental health. Gender, we can see, where do women work compared to men? Are women at the table to be able to even have their voice heard about what climate change means to them and the future that they want to see? Race is a huge piece of it. And we can go on and on and on about race, and I think that was really pinpointed in the opening talk. And then there's the pre-existing health and conditions. So you can think about, there are people who have been marginalized their entire lives. Their health is affected by that, and now climate on top of that is really going to be decreasing their life as well. So those are the things that I kind of think about, and that's why we're feeling anxiety. All of this is happening, so it's real, and I think we have to say that it's real. So some of the impact that we see specifically, and I don't know if I'm at 5 minutes. Am I at 5 minutes? Yep. I am? Okay. So I will just say, please be hopeful. Have your call to action and do exactly what everybody says. It's all of us who have to stand up, and we have to be awkward and uncomfortable, and we have to say the things that have to be said to the people who have been making the rules for us right along, and the rules are wrong. Just so you know, the rules are wrong, so we need to change them.
Thank you, Cyndi, and I will take the clicker for my part. Sure. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody, and I'm going to kind of pick up where Cyndi left off, because I'm going to talk about a specific area of mental health impact when we're thinking about climate change, and that's going to be trauma. So my name, by the way, is Dr. Rev Powell. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work here at the university, but I also work in the community as a psychotherapist. And so one of the areas I see climate change coming up in that work has to do with conceptualizing natural disasters as trauma. Now, this is important because, of course, with climate change, we're seeing an increasing number of these extreme climate events. With that, we're seeing an increase in experienced trauma. So we can understand natural disasters as what I might call a criterion A trauma, which is a term to refer to specific types of traumatic experiences that really serve as a prerequisite for developing PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, if we look at the general population, we know that about half of the population of the United States will experience a trauma in their lifetime. And amongst that half, about 7% will go on to develop PTSD. When we look at natural disasters in particular, we see a range of PTSD resulting from these trauma exposures. So from about 7%, kind of that general population number, all the way up to 24%. That 24% particularly happens for those folks who are first responders and also those folks living at the epicenter of the natural disaster, at the center of that damage. Now, it's important to note that PTSD is an important consequence when we're thinking about natural disasters and climate change, but certainly not everyone who experiences a trauma develops PTSD. Regardless, it's still traumatic stress, and that has an impact on your health and well-being. And that's not even talking about the indirect mental health impacts of natural disasters. So things like poverty and bereavement, missing your home, missing loved ones, missing the communities that you've been a part of. So I want to look at a specific example, and that's a lot of text, but it's coming in from somebody who survived the 2017 hurricanes in Puerto Rico. And he talks about not knowing what's going on in the context of this natural disaster or these multiple hurricanes that were occurring, not even being able to contact his mom. And he goes on to say, anxiety grew. I had poor concentration, erratic sleep, distressing nightmares, and was startled when hearing sirens or gunshots at night. Agitation and anxiety would alternate with apathy, withdrawal, and numbness. Some symptoms improved, but I struggled to stay motivated and productive. I wanted to forget what happened, but how could I? Debris still lines the street, some towering as high as homes. One of the hardest realizations was that recovery from this hurricane would not take months, but years. This was a rude awakening to the vulnerability of the very institutions that are expected to be able to respond in situations such as these. Hope waxes and wanes. Now, I chose this quote because I think that it really exemplifies and maybe helps to validate typical trauma responses. So a cornerstone of trauma is experiencing a sense of helplessness and being out of control. And we hear this at the end when he talks about no one who is supposed to respond to the situation in that moment was responding. He felt like no one was there to help him get out of it. Right? That's a certain feeling of helplessness. It's an acute response to trauma. We also see some of the quintessential symptoms of PTSD in what he's describing. So we see re-experiencing, which can look like intrusive thoughts or flashbacks we talk about a lot with PTSD, can look like recurrent nightmares. We see some avoidance. So he talks about wanting to forget about what happened, which is another symptom of PTSD, because when we feel distressed, we try to avoid, because it's not nice to sit there with those feelings. He talks about changes in his thoughts and feelings for the negative, so a lot of detachment from the things that typically brought him joy or the people that brought him joy. Again, this is a common trauma response after experiencing something so difficult. And he also talks about this increase in arousal and reactivity. We might talk about this as hypervigilance. So he talks about this increase in a startle response, having a hard time concentrating, and difficulty sleeping. So I'd like to use this as an example to describe not just natural disasters as trauma, but really looking at what do we mean by trauma and what can a trauma response look like. Now, I'm going to end with some ways to cope after experiencing a natural disaster, because I think it's important to note that there are things that we can do to personally be resilient in the context of these experiences. So the first is a very natural response for many people to a trauma, and it's to tend and befriend. So what many people do when they've experienced a disaster, both natural and man-made, is they tend to look for those folks more vulnerable than them, often children or the elderly, and think about how they can take care of those individuals. This can be helpful because it creates more resilient communities, but it also helps to reestablish a sense of agency for oneself. It can also be helpful, this comes with an asterisk, to avoid avoiding. And what I mean by this is after a few weeks of this trauma having occurred, it can be helpful to talk about what you experienced, because when we do avoid, that brings about some short-term relief, but it can increase distress in the long term. So it's important to be able to talk about what we went through. That being said, the night after a traumatic experience, a natural disaster, isn't necessarily the time to talk about everything that happened. It's really powerful in those moments to instead kind of turn turn your eyes away from doom scrolling, right? Like keeping updated on everything terrible that's happening, limiting your news exposure, and engaging in things that bring you joy and calm, which can feel sometimes ridiculous when you've just experienced a natural disaster. It's like, I'm gonna read a book after I just lost my home. So this can bring up a lot of feelings, but it's an important part of self-care and promoting your own resilience. And then lastly, I like to tell people to always be gracious with ourselves. Healing is nonlinear. You have good days and you have bad days. So after experiencing something like a natural disaster, it's good to be gentle with yourself and allow yourself to grow and heal in whatever capacity that's going to look like for you. So thanks, y'all.
Thank you. My name is Selma Holden. I'm an associate professor at the College of Osteopathic Medicine in the primary care department. I work in the Center of Excellence in Public Health, helping out with some opioid use disorder prevention programs, and I'm a medication-assisted therapist in a private mental health clinic up in Portland. So today I'm talking as somebody who's in the sandwich generation. So I'm a mother and I'm a daughter, and I have children and I have aging parents. And so I'm going to take some liberties about talking the older generations and then the younger generations, knowing that I'm an intersection between those two. I also am somebody who's cisgendered, white, comes from a lot of privilege, and I'm just a student in this area. So I'm trying to acknowledge some of the knowledge gaps I have, but I'm also learning always about this. So I wanted to follow up on some of the comments that you made, Dr. Powell, because I think I loved what you raised about the post-traumatic stress disorder that can occur from extreme weather events. Extreme weather events are something that we can easily measure. They make clear signals that we can look in the data, and then we can look at how people are responding afterwards. In the mental health area that I'm in, there's a discussion about maybe we shouldn't call it post-traumatic stress disorder, and maybe we should call it post-traumatic stress reaction. Because when people experience traumatic events, there are natural emotions that people are going to have. And so when we talk about re-experiencing and avoidance, maybe that's just on a spectrum of anxiety. And yes, there's a disordered place that people can go with the anxiety, but that's not the only place. There is this whole spectrum of just, it's normal and natural. Like say you're having negative thoughts and feelings. That's feeling sad and depressed. And those emotions move, well, including arousal and hyperactivity, the hypervigilance piece, and that's anger. And so is it really disordered to have emotional responses to traumatic events? Is sort of the question that's going on in this process. And how would the health of the people who experience trauma be shifted if the emotions were approached as normal reactions to be with and components of human life to work through and grow with? And sort of this bounce back and the resilience, and how do we grow from traumatic events? And so this piece that's going on is that when you think about natural disasters, those are sort of what we might call the big T traumas that happen. They're clear, they're documented and looked at. But there's this also creep of the slow traumas that are happening within climate collapse or crisis. So droughts, rising sea levels, losing access to clean water. How is that impacting agriculture? How is that impacting land use? How is that impacting economics? And then we're going into the stream of climate refugees. But those slow shifts are much harder to measure. And so the piece is that these subtle events are still being felt, and from a younger generational perspective, or those who are at the disadvantage of it, it could really bring up resentment in that piece. And so I was interested in the generational piece. So here's just a picture of the this is where I'm going to stand and say that there's this well-documented quote-unquote generational divide. It was sort of brought up in the panel that I was in, the climate justice just before, in the sense of it was politicized, but I'm going to put it in sort of the age perspective, is that despite the multiple lines of evidence clearly showing that climate collapse is happening, that we're in a crisis, that we're having clearly recorded mental health effects and physical health effects and beyond, there's still a debate going on in the upper generation. And so Rev Powell brought up the climate deniers and sort of the narrative about how that was a reaction from corporations who had oil interests. And that has a lasting effect. And with that debate still happening in the people who are older and in power, that is stalling the changes in policy. And with that stalling and change in policy, that's going to be experienced by other people as a lack of support, as neglect, as these just being ignored. And therefore, the younger generation is inheriting this burden. And the younger generation in the polls, they more readily accept and acknowledge that that we are in a climate crisis. So there was another point in there, sorry. So the climate, and I also just want to say that I also appreciate Rev Powell standing up and saying, I don't want to make a sweeping generalization about all the older generation, right? There are some hardcore activists who have been really trying to put up a fight for a long period of time. It's just that when we get into these polarizing situations, those of us who then are in the younger generation can say, well, you all messed up the older people up there, or something along those lines, and vice versa. So the thing is that resentment and feelings like that, it's pretty difficult to cultivate compassionate perspectives towards the older generation. Can people really think, well, maybe they were just thinking about they were nervous about a lot of other things, and they were pragmatically dealing with more immediate needs, the more immediate need for shelter, the more immediate need for social stability and economic security. Maybe they don't want to feel the uncomfortable feelings of shame and the hopelessness around it. So what I'm curious about is, what if we could find a common ground about the shared grief around this? And I'm curious about this. A lot of other people are curious about this as well. So if a shared understanding is that a substantially profound loss is happening, and there's going to be something that the younger generations are not going to be able to experience. We're turning to the younger generations that are saying, now, like as I jump back and forth, you all have to conserve your oil consumption, all right? And so there's sort of this restrictive perspective that's happening that way as well. And then, so there's these pieces about the grief around it. And what I feel are some helpful steps for people to be in the grief with other people is to change the language from climate change, which is kind of euphemistic at this point, and to say things such as climate collapse or climate crisis. And so can people in the older generations slip into that more uncomfortable territory that's at least giving some acknowledgement of that loss? And then if the older generations could understand that there is a grief process that is going on. And in this grief process, there's going to be anxiety, there's going to be sadness, there's going to be anger. And that is normal and justified, is the piece too. And so, so then from a therapeutic perspective, when emotions are happening, or just from a parenting perspective, what you want to acknowledge the existence of the feelings. You don't want to deny them. You want to allow people to express their feelings. You don't want to allow people to suppress them. So this piece about like the processing that happens after traumatic events. And then through that, in most circumstances, the emotions will evolve naturally. They don't stay forever. It's often the unexpressed emotions that then become pathologized. And so, so I want to go into the example with anger. I'm almost done. From the anger perspective, going back to that piece about the younger generation are justified in being angry. And we have this colonialist history, and I'm going to put in sort of this white, privileged, upper middle class female perspective about how I was taught to deal with anger, and what were appropriate ways to express anger and what were inappropriate ways to express anger. And that, what I find is helpful is that anger is very healthy when boundaries are violated or when safety is in threat. And that, I think, are justifiable reasons about what the younger generation is inheriting. Their safety is at threat. Boundaries of trust from their elder generations have been violated in that sense. And so the perspective, though, going back to a psychodynamic perspective, is that anger that is turned inward because people aren't allowed to express anger outwardly turns into depression. And so when we think about the increase in depression going on, is this because the anger is not allowed to be expressed in certain ways? And so then the question is, how do we express anger? Because in a therapeutic perspective, anger is actually a better emotion to work with somebody than sadness, because anger is activating. And so the attitude is, I'd rather be mad than sad, because mad makes me do something. And so then the ask is, how do we have the anger in a way that's not destructive? How do we channel the anger in a way that motivates people, that gets change going in a way that's going to be transformative and hopefully not entirely destructive? Because, all right, so sort of the final thing. So the pieces is that sort of like so this is a lot of different conceptual frameworks about how we're approaching anger, how we're approaching post-traumatic stress, and these pieces behind it. Because I think a narrative that I've been enjoying recently is that typically we'll hear this, we have to save the earth. And it can come from this anger place. And it's sort of this, like, it's this idea that we are going to save the earth. And I have a dark reality that actually we're going to destroy ourselves and the earth is going to be messed up for a while, but it's going to be fine. It's going to reach a new state of homeostasis. It's going to be beautiful in its own ways and will be gone. And so there is this piece about how, okay, so are we really going to save the earth, or is our process to more serve the earth and allow the earth to save us? Because when you look into the literature about how to engage, like they find that people who want to navigate the harder emotions of climate change, climate collapse, engaging in the environment, being in the environment, and just doing simple, small things to help out in the environment has these very helpful effects for mood and attitude. So the relationship I really enjoy, just to finish this up, thank you for your patience, is Robin Wallace Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. She's just has a beautiful native perspective that it's not the earth that is broken, it's our relationship to the earth that's broken. And so if we could find ways to shift our relationship, so that's why I like serving the earth, or the earth is actually saving me. And my duty is just to serve the earth and to go ahead with that, as opposed to being angry at other people and being like, you got to save the earth. I think it's a throw me, right? So, and then the hope with that is also a way to maintain sustainability. I can't speak tonight. So this piece about anger, if it burns you too much, you're going to burn out. And so how to just titrate the anger in ways that it will be a nice fuel for you going on, and you'll be able to do this for the many decades, such as the Reverend's been doing it and others. So thank you.
And what a perfect segue into mine. Hi, I'm Erin Neptune. I am the health and wellness educator. And I tend to tell people I have an insatiable hunger for knowledge. Insatiable. It means I can't get enough. And I'm constantly thinking that I'll never know enough. And I've spent years of my life reframing that in my head as, what else can I learn? And I've learned that there's benefit to slowing down so that I can do more of the things that I'm passionate about, but I'll get to that in a minute. My goal in life, both professionally and personally, is to help people cultivate sustainable self-transformation, and that has to include myself. I feel it's important to tell you all, especially for this talk, that I've struggled and thrived with mental illness my entire life. And I express that because in addition to my research and my education, my approach to well-being comes from a deep sense of empathy. I want to show everyone that there's endless possibilities, experiences, and strategies we can all discover and keep discovering to help improve our lives. And over the last decade or so, I found that the more anxiety and the fear that I had, the more limitations I felt, and the more I felt like I was running out of time. Because we all want to save the world, right? But by choosing to meditate for 60 minutes or to go for a 3-mile walk, I didn't lose an hour in the day. Because the more I find time for things that decrease this like sheer metaphorical and sometimes physical weight and heaviness of anxiety and fear, the more I seem to accomplish in less time. And yes, that is a reference to Einstein's theory of relativity and time dilation, but there's not enough time to get into that. My point is that there is time to take care of ourselves, if we only know how. And one of my biggest roles here at UNE as the health and wellness educator is to help people figure out what they need to do for their own well-being. Because self-care means something different at all points in our life. And I've found it overwhelming at times, this ardent passion, overcompensating for others' lack of care for others, our planet, and themselves, burning myself out to ultimately end up helping no one, and no quick fix was sustainable. So improving overall well-being needs to be intentional, consistent, approached with a compassionate curiosity without judgment of wherever we're at. But there's times where I didn't know where to turn. So over the last few years, I've developed a wellness assessment called Waves of Wellness. And it's a way to help identify what to do about the aspects of wellness that might need some attention. And sometimes the stress is overwhelming and overstimulating, because even if we recognize what we need to do we even do it? And I help people take this overwhelming hurricane of a vague, overarching stress response to help find some tangible solutions. And we're not alone. And we all need different sorts of help and direction from time to time. Because as the health and wellness educator, sure, I help people with personalized nutrition plans and education. I run weekly yoga classes and mindfulness activities each day of the week here on campus. But I don't know all of the answers. I'm here to be a liaison for whatever you might need, and to connect you to different departments like mine, recreation and wellness. Because whether it's learning how to pack a day pack safely to go for a hike, or to learn how to use the pit shark in the fitness center, we all need different things. And sure, we're trying to help you become more aware of your own skills, but we want you to cope better with whatever life throws at you. And I've tried to do it all, and I'm here telling you that it just doesn't work. I can't help anyone if I can't help myself first. And these resources, they're the compass, not the map. Each one of us ultimately has to choose our own path. So non-judgment, compassionate curiosity, and utilizing resources are what I've found to make self-transformation attainable and sustainable, because change happens regardless, and how we adapt to change makes all the difference in the world, so that we can continue to fight to change the future of our world. Thank you.
Thank you for all your comments on navigating climate anxiety. At this time, I would like to open up to questions or comments. Feel free to address your questions to the entire panel, to a particular person, or to the entire audience.
Hi, guys. First of all, that was incredible. My question is kind of related to fear tactics in terms of when, say, you're watching the news or you're scrolling and on a news feed and all you're seeing is just all the negative things going on, but you also know that it is important to educate yourself on what's going on, obviously, in current events. So, what are your recommendations or suggestions in terms of, dealing with that fear after watching the news and, keeping yourself informed what's going on, but not letting it, stop you from, making changes in your life, if that makes sense?
We all have a lot of ideas about this one. I think limiting the amount of time you spend with news is super important. Don't overdo it. And, a lot of the panelists have talked about connection, and, maybe you watch the news with somebody else and you take turns listening, and you get to, just hearkening back to what I shared, maybe you shake a little, or maybe you laugh, or, allow yourself to have the feelings, right, in that situation, ideally with another friend, and stay connected. Don't get isolated in it all. That's my key recommendation.
I wholeheartedly agree with those. I think the other thing is to really think about the sources you're getting information from, and if those are difficult for you to endure, then you shouldn't do that. That's not helpful in learning and understanding the world. And I think that's the one thing, is we have to learn to be really critical consumers of information. And you're at a university, and there are all sorts of pieces of information and data that's going to give you information that you can process. So I think you go on that curiosity scavenger hunt to find what you need, but it's really important to step back, because the media isn't going, well, it's going to help you know what's going on in the world from their perspective, but you need to develop your own perspective and find that information in different ways. So I think that's what I would say.
And I would maybe add on to that. I know sometimes when I have this experience, I feel like I can't allow myself to stop being angry. Like if I stop being angry, I'm giving up something important, I'm becoming apathetic or complacent. And I think those are the moments where I remind myself that it's important that I, as a human, because I believe this of humans, we have a right to enjoy the world as well as to change it. And so I try to remind myself that it's okay for me to enjoy this beautiful world that I'm a part of. But I also think very concretely about what's within my control, like you're speaking to, and what's outside of my control. And I try to make a decision about one thing that I can be more intentional about the next week. So I feel like I'm doing something, but also giving myself that chance to say, it's okay to enjoy the world too. That seems to help me.
In addition to all of the above, I think actively seeking out sources that are happy or bring you joy, because a lot of the news that we, again, doom scroll, are somewhat programmed to get our attention and to like have a reaction, and they're not going to post about a nice fluffy cat or something. Like it's not going to be something super happy. So I don't know. I think it's also actively seeking out sources of information that don't have that reaction as well, because we're just so overexposed to it.
Hi. When you're sharing information about climate change and stuff with other people, how do you avoid catastrophizing while still making the importance of the topic come across?
I think there's a lot to catastrophizing it. I think that's what we learned in the, some of the comments. We are in a crisis. And I think one of the things that we need to do is we need to be really upfront and clear that it's true and not get co-opted into saying that maybe it isn't. Having said that, having conversations that are civil and that we can come to some sort of agreement and understanding and help people understand and see the world differently is really, really important. So I think the best way to do that is to listen and not think about what you're going to say to somebody and how you're going to prove them wrong, but to listen to what they're saying and try to understand that from your perspective and then share it.
Yeah, and I think always having a balance of attention on how many good things are happening in the world with how many horrible things are happening in the world. And I always think there's more good than bad happening in the world. And I do think I've had the privilege of hanging out with a lot of Passamaquoddy and Penobscot people and talking to them a bit about climate and getting their perspective on it. And I sense from them a little bit more confidence that they have withstood genocide, diseases and plagues and threats to their existence for centuries, and they have a slightly different take, that yes, it's awful, yes, it's a catastrophe, but they've lived through that kind of stuff before. So I see this kind of balance of attention that they have that I'd like to be around and kind of feel some of that we're going to go forward. They went forward. African heritage people went forward. They didn't get so discouraged by enslavement that it stopped them. They went forward. So I get a lot from paying attention to what other groups have withstood and still gone forward.
Yeah, there's a piece about the listening and trying to figure out who you're talking to. So I was I was up at Saddleback and a few weeks ago or a few months ago, and just having a casual conversation with a father and their child when I'm there with my child. And it's in that environment, it was that father did a really crafty way when we started going into the climate change conversation. He could bring up an example of hope and sort of this technological advancement in the piece. And so instead of catastrophizing to our 11, 12-year-old children, sort of having this resource of like, what are the hopes? And then so for the younger folks, they don't need more catastrophe. There's enough news going on in that piece. But then I might have more of an agenda when I'm talking with older folks and sort of trying to get a fire under them in that piece about, okay, so there's a piece about the audience.
Thank you so much. And we have come to the end of the hour. And before we close, we do have a brief video from the Worldwide Teach-In.
At your teach-in, you've discussed concrete actions you can move forward in your community. Time is short for climate injustice. Help others move from climate despair to climate action. As the young people say, now, not next month, not next year. Let's commit today, together, to create a just and sustainable future for people and planet.
Thank you all for becoming leaders on climate and justice.
Obrigada a todos por se tornarem líderes em clima e justiça.
Thank you all for becoming leaders on climate and justice.
जलवायु और न्याय पर वर्ल्डवाइड टीचिंग में आप सभी का स्वागत है।
Thank you for joining us tonight, and please join me in thanking our panelists and everyone who participated in this discussion. This concludes our program for the evening, and we hope the information you have learned and talked about tonight will stay with you. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.